Hello, and welcome to the New York State Archives webinar module series on record scheduling, a family of short presentations providing overviews of topics related to retention and disposition of government records. This module's topic is records disposition. My name is Maria McCashion, and I will be your presenter. This presentation will define records disposition and explain its function and importance to your records management program. It's intended to provide state agencies and local governments with an overview of the steps involved in records disposition. State agencies and local governments should be sure to follow their respective legal disposition requirements under the Arts and Cultural Affairs Law and the regulations of the Commissioner of Education, as well as any internal policies and procedures your government has for disposing records. For this module, disposition means when records either leave your organization's custody through destruction, or are transferred to another entity, or are permanently preserved within your organization. One distinction should be made between state agency and local government permanent records. Both retain custody of and store records identified as permanent on a retention schedule. State agency schedules may indicate transfer to archives for certain records. This means that the state archives has determined that the records have archival value and custody of the records must be transferred to the state archives. Local governments can determine for themselves whether any non-permanent records are archival or historical and retain them permanently within their own organization. Disposition is part of the overall management of records throughout their life cycle. It takes place when a record is no longer needed for business purposes and has either met its legal retention requirements or has a permanent retention period and needs to be prepared for and moved to permanent storage. Disposition should be applied to only one official copy of record. Ideally, your records management program will have a system for centrally filing and storing only official record copies, and duplicates will be kept separate and disposed of as soon as they're no longer needed. Regular disposition has many benefits. It promotes record keeping your government and the public can trust. Organizations that don't practice regular disposition are often reluctant to destroy records because staff are unfamiliar with the process. When a local government or a state agency has no regular documented process for destroying records, it has no evidence to show the public that records are being disposed of appropriately. And it can defend your organization in the event of an audit or litigation by creating evidence that decisions to dispose of records are consistent and based on established policy. Disposition that includes documenting destroyed records can also help keep track of records an organization no longer has. And it's cost effective. Regular destruction of unneeded records can save you both physical and virtual storage space. And it promotes efficiency by removing records no longer needed through destruction or with storage, making it easier to access the records that you do need. Successful disposition relies on management, who can appoint a records management officer or RMO, and allocate staff time and resources to support disposition needs. A records management officer who works with management and staff in the organization to develop a program for regular disposition retention schedules that are developed by the state archives for state agencies and local governments. Staff cooperation is essential. The success of a program relies on everyone's participation. And documentation of records destroyed proves that records were destroyed legally. Successful disposition relies on addressing preservation needs for permanent records to ensure their permanency, and on regular practice, which creates familiarity and acceptance. Training for new and current staff is necessary to maintain a successful program. These are steps in the disposition process. We'll talk more about each on the next slides. Records should be identified, ideally with an inventory, and checked against an appropriate retention and disposition schedule. These steps should be led by the records management officer, coordinating with staff in individual offices. Records destruction should be documented and conducted with confidential information in mind. And permanent records must be preserved. Records management officers should maintain an inventory of records identified in an organization. Staff and individual departments know their records, they know how they're used, and they can determine when records are no longer needed. So they should work with the records management officer to identify records covered by an established records retention schedule. Management should provide resources, allocate staff time, and sign off on policies and procedures to support an inventory. Records should be identified for disposition at the record series level. This is how records information is presented in retention schedules. A record series is a group of related records that are normally used and filed as a unit, like board minutes or purchase orders. Once record series are identified, information about them should be collected in an inventory. Details like the originating department, series title, date span of the records, a description of how the records are used, and other information. Staff in each department should work with the records management officer to develop an inventory of the records in their offices. Maintaining information on records in an inventory can eliminate doubts about how individual record series should be managed. It can create documentation to support your records management program, and it can make subsequent disposition much easier. If you need inventory forms or instructions, the state archives can provide you with them. After records are identified, check an appropriate schedule to determine retention periods. Those retention periods can be documented in your inventory as well. State Archives develops retention and disposition schedules, as I mentioned, for local governments and state agencies, and these guide records disposition, and they authorize the legal destruction of government records. Local governments use the retention and disposition schedule for New York local government records. Its short name is the LGS-1. State agencies use the State Agency General Schedule and State Agency Specific Schedules. Retention schedules list each record series with a brief description, a unique item number, and a minimum retention period. Your organization must ensure the records are available and accessible for the minimum retention period. The minimum retention period is also the final disposition for the records, and it's when non-permanent records can be destroyed. That is, as long as there are no current or anticipated legal or fiscal needs to retain them longer, such as with a potential legal claim or an audit. Retention schedules don't require that records be destroyed at the end of that minimum retention period. So if you need to retain certain records longer, best practice is to document the reason for longer retention in internal procedures. This will provide proof of normal practice and explain the longer retention and ensure that the records are consistently managed. Some retention schedule reminders. When carrying out disposition, be sure you're using the most current schedule for your government's records. And if you're not sure which schedule you should be using, you can contact the state archives. If your records have been labeled with a destruction date for a while, it's good to double check the retention period in your retention schedule to be sure that it hasn't changed. And if you're applying a destruction date to the records for the first time and you're having difficulty finding a match for your record, you can contact the state archives for assistance. Record series must match an item in your retention schedule. And if there is no match, which does happen once in a while, the state archives will work with you to create a schedule for it if it's a state agency record, or to assign it a temporary item if it's a local government record. Staff participating in a disposition program led by the Records Management Officer ensures that records of those individual offices are identified and retained as long as they're needed for business. And it ensures that disposition needs for records in individual offices are met, as well as permanent and essential records of those offices are protected, and confidential records in those offices are identified and access is restricted. In addition, non-permanent records can also be labeled with destruction dates and regularly disposed of legally following approved retention schedules. So everyone working together can make disposition less of a burden and more like the routine business process that it should be. Documenting destruction is best practice for records being destroyed in any format. It creates a system of checks and balances to reduce the risk of unauthorized records disposal, and it adds a layer of legal protection to show that your organization properly followed your retention schedule and that records weren't destroyed to avoid disclosing them in response to a FOIL litigation or audit request. The State Archives has a sample form that you can use, like the one on the slide. You can contact us for a copy of the form, or you'll find it on our website in publication number 41, Retention and Disposition of Records, How Long to Keep Records, and How to Destroy Them. You can modify the form to suit your needs, but it should contain at least the record series title, date span of the records, the matching retention schedule item and retention period, and signatures authorizing records destruction. Ideally, these signatures include the Records Management Officer and head of the record series originating department. If your government uses a vendor for records destruction, additional fields could be added for their signatures. As records are being identified and documented for destruction, the Records Management Officer and department head or designated staff should double check the retention schedule item to be sure it was correctly applied to the records. They should consider whether the minimum retention period is appropriate or should be increased for a real need. So, for example, to administer the records longer to the public or for historical significance. They should note whether staff are storing records for a needlessly long period of time and as a result are incurring unnecessary storage costs or potential legal risks. And it should be considered whether any records are the subject of a current or pending legal action, audit, or FOIL request. State law does not specify a destruction method for most records. Organizations can choose a method of destruction, and there are various ways to destroy paper and other physical records. For example, shredding, bonded recycling, or incineration. Records containing confidential information should be securely destroyed. If your organization contracts with a shredding vendor, be sure that the vendor provides you with sign-off or certification of records destruction. Deletion of digital files and/or electronic media should be coordinated with your IT staff or contracted IT vendor. Electronic records on computer hard drives and storage media can be permanently destroyed using methods such as degaussing, which destroys data on computer storage media by exposing it to a powerful magnetic field, or physically destroying the media, which should be done to government hard drives and backup tapes being decommissioned. Many paper shredding companies now also address computer media destruction. Verified proof of data erasure and destruction should also be maintained on electronic records. To reuse computer media or a hard drive, specialized software can be used to overwrite or wipe data without destroying the equipment. The chart on this slide is a part of a guide from the New York State Office of Information Technology Services entitled Erasing Information and Disposal of Electronic Media. And there's a link to the guide if you want to know more about reliable methods for disposing of electronic records. Preservation of permanent records involves storing them under optimal conditions to ensure their permanency. Permanent records must be monitored and migrated to new formats before a record becomes inaccessible or any information is lost. Ideally, permanent paper and other physical records should be stored in a climate-controlled vault, and their various formats, paper, film, photographs, maps, etc., should be stored in folders, boxes, and other containers that protect the original record. Permanent records should be created and/or stored on stable medium, such as acid-free paper for paper records and PDFAs for electronic records. Preservation backups should be created for permanent records and stored remotely, especially if storage conditions are not optimal. Digital or microfilm formats created following state archive standards can be reliable preservation backups for paper records. Standards for creating these formats can be found in 2 state archives publications, the Digital Imaging Guidelines and Producing High-Quality Microfilm. Care for permanent electronic records should be coordinated with IT. Permanent electronic records should have archival backups that are unchanging, unlike daily backups. Both daily backups and archival backups should be remote, with the data far enough away from your primary site so that both locations can't be affected by the same disaster. Permanent electronic records should be maintained and preserved following the requirements described in the regulations of the Commissioner of Education, sections 188.20 for state agencies and 185.8 for local governments. These require that documentation be maintained on permanent electronic records, information such as what they are, their location, their formats, any restrictions, and other details, as well as information about the systems and the media storing the records. This information is necessary to monitor the formats, systems, and media, and to develop a migration plan for future upgrades to maintain the records. Each of these has an important role in making your disposition program a success. Management, supporting a program led by the records management officer, providing necessary resources for regular records destruction and records preservation needs. Regular disposition, carried out at least once a year and not in response to running out of storage in any format. Documenting destruction to defend your organization's program. Preparing an annual report from management that describes what's been done to dispose of records during the year is a good way to keep them informed about the time and resources necessary for the work. And it can help incorporate records disposition into regular business, and it can be used to plan and prepare for disposition in the following year. Thank you for viewing this webinar. Please check out our other retention and scheduling modules in this series and other records management webinars on the State Archives website. If you have any questions about records disposition or anything else related to managing your records, contact us at recmgmt@nysed.gov.